Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Koihime Enbu. What I'm reviewing is the PC version, although I believe it was released on PS3, PS4, and it was originally an arcade game. Although, honestly, I don't really have all that much information on the game itself. Now, I mean it when I say I couldn't really find all that much information on the game itself other than the Steam release. I know it was developed by Unknown Games and M2 Company Limited and published by Degika, and I believe the PS3 and PS4 version came out in January, while the Steam release was in May of this year. Now, I actually was provided a review copy of this, and I am greatly appreciative of that because of a couple of reasons. One, which I will get to more when I get to my conclusions in this review itself. The other being that had the PR people not actually made me aware of the game in the first place, I probably wouldn't have even known it existed, simply because there wasn't really much push for it. As far as I can tell, the PC release just kind of showed up out of nowhere. It's like, hey guys, this is a thing, it's available on Steam now. Though I do imagine that fans of the overarching series Koihime Muso are aware of its existence, or if they're not aware of it, at least they're somewhere in the right direction of being aware of it. Then again, I didn't even know the overarching series existed, although to be fair, I'm not into visual novels, so obviously I really wasn't gonna know the actual visual novel existed. And I haven't really been watching anime or reading manga for quite a long time either, so I just simply didn't know those versions of the series existed either. So I basically had no frame of reference for this game other than the fact that it is a fighting game and all of the characters are women. So since I have absolutely no prior knowledge of the series whatsoever and have no frame of reference for it whatsoever, I went into this game just viewing it as a fighting game, and let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out exactly how it is as a fighting game. Well, as far as presentation goes, there's really nothing all that impressive about the visuals in particular. The characters themselves look very out of place compared to the backgrounds. They have this sort of 3D model that is cel-shaded look, sort of like Guilty Gear Xr's art style, if you're familiar with that, where they had the game made in a 3D engine, but they used a cel-shading technique to actually make it look like a 2D game. The difference between that and this, however, is that this is a full 2D game, and that does show sometimes. Namely, the characters look out of place compared to the backgrounds. The backgrounds have a sort of hand-painted look, whereas the characters themselves look like 3D models that were converted to 2D. But on top of that, you'll see a bunch of aliasing on the characters themselves, so they actually have pretty jagged edges on them, and often the animations look a bit stiff. This is because generally when you're making a 2D animation, you want to do it in as few frames as possible so you minimize the amount of work that you have to do, while also still maintaining the right number of frames to make everything still look smooth and fluid. They didn't quite nail it here. Although in the moment you're focused more on the action and not quite as much on the looks, so it does sort of work out in the long run. It's just a pity that they couldn't make the visuals look a bit better. And this is especially true when you engage the Hyogis. They are your ultra super move, where triggering them actually gives you a short cutscene before unleashing a very, very powerful attack. And quite frankly, the animation on those Hyogis looks pretty awful, and to understand that, I'm just going to show you one. It's kind of weird when the actual character animations for the fighting part of the game look better than the CG parts. And while the CG artwork itself isn't so bad, the animations during the Hyogis just look downright terrible. Luckily, things get a bit better when you get to the sound design, where the sound effects are generally fairly solid. They work rather well for what they're trying to do. They're definitely anime style, although none of them are really all that remarkable. And then of course there's the voice acting, which is entirely in Japanese, and that's going to be pretty hit or miss for you depending entirely on whether or not you are okay with female Japanese voices. Now, while I don't have any problems with it, I know for a lot of people, female Japanese voices are like nails on a chalkboard, so just keep that in mind if you're going into this thing. But really, you're not going to be paying too much attention to it simply because when you're playing the game, there's too much going on for you to really focus on the voice acting. But what you can focus a bit more on is the soundtrack, which is a mixture of traditional Asian influences as well as a sort of J-rock and J-pop and electronic stuff, which all works rather well. It's very upbeat for the most part and fairly fast-paced, so that means that it's definitely in keeping with the action, and it's pretty easy to get into. And it's definitely fitting with the theme as well, so they definitely did a good job with the soundtrack at the very least. When you look at the presentation as a whole, it just ends up being a very mixed bag. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although the story in this is really not much of anything. It's just a bunch of characters deciding, hey, I'm going to go do stuff, and then they go do stuff, and it doesn't really seem to have any bearing on really anything. I mean, to give you a prime example, there's a couple of characters who just say, you know what, I want to go on a quest. Okay, and that quest involves what? Are you trying to save someone or something? No, I'm just gonna go wander around the countryside and just do whatever I feel like, basically. And that's really all you're gonna get from the storylines in this game. There's really not much to them. There's no real overarching plot, and every single character just kind of goes off and does their own thing for their own reasons. This means a few things. First off, the stories themselves are generally fairly ridiculous if they're not just bland and uninteresting. I mean, to give you a prime example, one of the storylines involved fighting in a tournament over a superior peach. And by superior peach, I mean literally a fruit. They were fighting over a fruit. When I saw those lines of dialogue, I just sat there and stared at my computer for a good 10 seconds or so, just going, wait, what? And that was generally my experience with the story in general, because this game does an absolutely terrible job of explaining who these characters are, why they are the way they are, and what their relationships are with the other characters. It is very clearly assumed that if you are playing Koihime Enbu that you are a fan of Koihime Muso, so there is no need to explain any of this. That means that people like myself who have absolutely no prior experience with Koihime Muso are going to be completely left in the dust. This means that I had to look up information on Koihime Muso to get a better understanding of what's going on in Koihime Enbu. Apparently, it is very, very loosely based on Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The thing is that not only is it a gender-bent vision where every single main character is now female, but the original visual novel is actually an adult visual novel, and the anime is an ecchi series, which means that it's not quite as full-on adult as the original visual novel was, but it's still definitely not something that's really family-friendly, let's put it that way. But then you get to Koihime Enbu, and it's actually extremely restrained in that regard. There's only some mildly suggestive content here and there. It's really no worse than, say, Soul Calibur in the fan service department. Which, if you consider what series this comes from, is actually pretty impressive, but that's beside the point. The point is that instead of compensating for bad writing by just having tons of fan service, they decided to really not throw in much writing at all. And what writing does actually manage to work is mostly just because it's ridiculously silly. So it really does fall to the gameplay to bring this thing up, and that's where the game does sort of shine. It's kind of a weird situation because this is actually a very, very simple fighting game when you really get down to it. There's only really 4 modes. You have your basic training mode, you have the arcade ladder, you have scenario mode, which is basically just story mode, and then you have your versus or online mode. I just kind of lump those together. So it's basically 5 modes if you want to get really technical, but whatever. And when you go into one of these modes, you're given a selection of 13 fighters, most of whom have 2 different variations of the assistant ability, as what I guess I can call it. As far as I can tell, the game doesn't really have a name for it, but the idea is that you have a support character who will give you a certain ability in addition to the ones that you get as that character to begin with. So, for example, there's one that will just throw in a bunch of ranged weapons from the side of the screen. There's one that will cause a lightning strike, things like that. And each time you use one of these, you lose 1 tactics bar. You have a grand total of up to 4 tactics bars, and that's basically just your EX meter if you're used to other fighting game terminology. Of course, you build up your tactics meter by just landing damaging hits as well as even landing non-damaging hits or being hit yourself. And when you start the match, you get a first strike bonus, so whoever lands the first damaging hit instead of the first blocked hit is going to get an additional bonus amount of the tactics meter. Beyond that, every single character has 3 different special moves as well as an Ogi and a Hi-Ogi. The Ogi is basically a super move. It uses up 3 bars of your tactics meter and it lands a very, very damaging hit. The Hi-Ogi can only be used while in a Hogeki combo, which I'll explain more in a moment, but it will both do a large amount of damage, have its sort of cutscene cutaway, and it will end your Hogeki combo. It also uses all 4 bars of your tactics meter, so if you miss, then you lose the ability to do EX attacks as well as the ability to do your Ogi. But here's the thing, you don't really need to worry as much about that, because unlike other fighting games where the EX meter, or whatever it's called in that particular game, is a very, very vital resource, Koihime Enbu relies way more on your actual movement and your Hogeki combos than it does on anything else. With only 3 special moves and then the Ogi and Hi-Ogi for every single character, that means that every single character is very easy to learn. It just takes some practice, and the movements themselves are all very similar between them, so you don't really need to worry too much about wildly different approaches for different characters. Now, while this does make learning the characters easier, it also has the side effect of pretty much everybody feeling exactly the same. To give you a prime example, there are a bunch of characters who wield polearms, and they all feel pretty much the same. There are very slight differences, but you can barely tell those differences. This means that more often than not, what you end up picking a character on is the aesthetics rather than the actual fighting style. Do you want a character that uses a sword, or do you want a character that looks a certain way? That's pretty much what it comes down to. There are a couple of characters who do play very differently, and those are Kakoen, who is an archer, and obviously an archer is going to play very differently, but she also has a bunch of teleport moves, which are kind of BS, honestly, and Sunken, who has a couple of parry maneuvers that she can do. But whether you're playing those two or whether you're playing anyone else, what you're going to rely most on is the Hogeki combo. Basically, the idea is that you'll hit an enemy with an attack that causes them to fall over, and while they're falling over, you basically have free reign to engage a large combo, although the combos are usually more about 5 to 6 hits. I have had a couple that went up to about 10 hits, but no really more than that. Now, it's not quite as combo heavy as something like, say, Guilty Gear or Marvel vs. Capcom, but at the same time, it is more reliant on combos to actually deal out a fair deal of damage rather than anything else. And because of the way the attacks that actually cause that status effect are, what you're going to find is that you rely way more on your footwork than anything else. Your spacing, making sure that the enemy is just at the right angle to be able to hit, but not so far away that you can't hit them, and not so close that they can hit you. This means that the fights end up basically being a matter of poking at each other if you're playing against a skilled opponent. If you're playing against the AI early on in the game, before about stage 6 or 7 or so, then you're going to find that it's ridiculously easy just to start landing a long combo and annihilate the opponent. But of course, in the single player department, if you hit about stage 6, whether you're playing on scenario mode or arcade mode, you find that the difficulty spike is fairly dramatic. You go from pretty much ridiculously easy immediately to the AI being able to tell exactly what you're doing at every single point and being able to react to it in turn. I mean, let's face it, it's much less irritating to lose to an actual person than it is to a computer in this particular style of game, because if a human beats you, you know it was either a matter of luck, or it was a matter of skill. In the case of the computer beating you, it's because it just knows everything that you're doing. Which means that the game lulls you into a false sense of security with all of the ridiculously easy matches, and then all of a sudden it just starts kicking your ass, and you're like, wait, what did I do? Once you get used to how the game plays and you get used to the movesets and everything, it's not as much of a problem, but until you've actually adjusted to everything, that actually is very, very frustrating. Also frustrating is if you try to take this thing online to play against other people. You see, versus mode is only local mode. If you go online, you have to go through a sort of matchmaking system, and this is exactly what happens. As you can see, pretty much nobody is playing this thing. In fact, I was never able to get into an online match, so I couldn't tell you if the netcode's any good or not. I've seen some reports that it's pretty solid, but I can't actually confirm that myself. What I can confirm is that the community for this game is rather small. If you can actually manage to get into a match, it's a pretty good chance that you're gonna get your ass kicked, because the people who are still playing it are most likely the rather dedicated fans. Which is something of a shame, because the game has only been out for about 2 months on PC, which is really weird for it to die out that quickly. I think a big chunk of that, though, is because of the price tag. Now keep in mind what I've mentioned about this game so far. It is a very simple fighting game when you really get down to it, and there's really not that much content in it. Certainly not for the price tag, which is $40. To be quite frank, that's a pretty unreasonable asking price, particularly considering that there are quite a few fighting games on Steam now. There's a fair amount of anime fighting games on Steam, and most of them are not anywhere near $40. And not only are quite a few of those more complicated than this, but they have way more content, and even the ones that are actually as simple or even simpler than this tend to have more content than this. This means that while the game itself is actually very solid, the controls are very responsive, it's very easy to pick up and play, but it is challenging to master, and the fighting mechanics themselves work very well, it's just not a very good value proposition, and that does mean that it is a very difficult game to recommend, which is ultimately why I am giving this a 3 out of 5. Like I said, mechanically it's solid enough, it's just that it's very simplistic, there's not really enough variety in there, and there's really not very much content in here, certainly not to justify the $40 price tag. So if you can get it on sale for a good price, or if they lower the price of it eventually, then I can say you might want to pick it up if you're a fighting game fan or if you're a fan of Koihime Enbu. If you're neither of those things, however, I'd say pass on it. Thanks for watching.